Okay, guys. So this is kind of like a last minute deal, but I've also had this tab in my list for quite a while. So you can see that it's from December 6th, so it's still from this month, but it's been about a week and a half, little over a week, well, closer to a week and a day, I guess. So this article talks about LogoFail and kind of their research and what their methods to finding the LogoFail vulnerabilities and what it affects. So kind of the big thing with LogoFail is the fact that attackers can take advantage of the customization feature of boot logos in a large swath of devices. And even more than that, they can take advantage of that before the system even boots into UEFI. So this is something that is probably even worse than most anti-cheat in that it's not just kernel level, it's before we even hit the UEFI properly booting up, loading up its firmware, and getting things situated there. So it provides a huge surface of attack to where you get very, very system level without needing to go through a lot of the hassle of having to deal with the operating system or things like that. So they go through and they identify a few decoders. And one thing that they noticed about a lot of these decoders is one with the firmware. It generally doesn't have a regular update cycle. In UEFI or BIOS system, UEFI systems, we'll keep it that way. So the image decoders or parsers are generally out of date, and a lot of them are proprietary in a lot of cases. So they've got a few listed here for like bitmaps, TGAs, PNGs, JPEGs, and GIFs, and so on. And they are noticing the firmwares in it. Let's see. So in this case, the AMI-based firmware contains image parsers in a DXC module called AMI TSC. So they're just kind of like picking out what parts of the UEFI firmware are the decoder sections, and then they go through and reverse engineer it and go backwards through the steps that it takes in order to figure out what they can actually do with it, to find where the source images are from, and then what also along with it what the parser does with the image data. So again, this is just them going back through and showing that process. So here they notice that the UEFI can be easily targeted. So a lot of BIOSes in Lenovo, Dell's were halfway excluded, but Lenovo's, why can't I think of it? Acers and so on, use an image in the ESP of a system in order to grab the logo that they're going to display when you first boot up the computer before it even gets into the UEFI portion of the boot process. So you can take an image and put it in this spot, and then the system will look for the image there in order to display it to you before getting into the UEFI. Kind of gives you a fancy splash screen you can look at. And this is handy for OEMs and even end users to be able to customize the systems according to their needs. So in a standard chip or motherboard, in a standard chip that is used across multiple different motherboards and multiple different vendors, they can customize the boot logo so that it displays their logo, or that the end user can have a custom image for their boot logo just to feel good. And so they've posted a bunch of CVEs for this vulnerability because of just the sheer volume of security problems that it can cause. So let's see. Are they all the same here? Yeah. So I'll go down further. So you'll notice that a good number of these are actually vendors that are very popular with businesses. So like Dell's or HP, Lenovo. Intel is included in here because they're using Intel systems in order to display the boot logo. Even Firmware has this problem. So it's kind of part and parcel there. They have this list for LogoFail that they then dig deeper into after this. We include Samsung in there, MSI, Gigabyte for the gaming, Supermicro. I don't remember what they do specifically, but and Acer even. Acer's, Dell's, HP's, they end up being end-user devices at home as well. So this can cause a problem if someone is using their own computer as like a bring your own device for work on top of it. The diagram here is not very good for it, but yeah. So they go through, they look for bugs, and they do this by attacking the parser with a fuzzer that will input different image data into it just to see how many crashes they get and some of the results from that. So you have a large variety of data that is being fuzzed into these parsers, and we're just going to see if they fail or not. Let's see. Oh, and up in the table you can see here there's like various out of bounds, pointer dereferencing. Oh, I don't think there's some DXC memory corruption. So these are more particular with the DXC and the boot process there. Before we even get into like some of the other stuff. So here they have like a nice little GIF showing their little parsing thing. And their findings in how many crashes there actually were kind of astounding to them. So let's see, exposure of sensitive information for bitmap. Let's see, inside AMI. So these are the different chips that they use. And these are the three major chip vendors that most of these companies go with, being Inside, AMI, and Phoenix. So you've got the bitmap parser for Inside having some exposure of sensitive information problems in buffer overflow. You've also got GIFs having buffer overflow, out of bounds reads, null pointer dereferencing, exposure of sensitive information, nothing found for PNG, heap-based buffer overflow. Let's see, more exposure, buffer overflow, out of bounds, buffer overflow, out of bounds, integer overflow, and so on. So 29 unique crashes, out of which 15 were considered to be exploitable with arbitrary code execution. So let's see. And I find it interesting here. The only exception is Inside's PNG parser that is based on an open source project and was likely already well tested by the community. So this is where this proprietary nature of these code parsers inside of a system can be interesting, because you don't know how much they're stress testing their parsers, let alone how frequently they're updating it. But the stress testing of a parser like Binarly is doing here can reveal a lot about it. And in a lot of cases, open source communities and projects are able to be stress tested in different environments, or tested in different environments, and quickly triaged and worked on if there's someone available to fill in that hole. So yeah, we kind of go over the buffer overflows and things like that. So then they go to the root cause of kind of like, So the root cause of it, they say, is the lack of validation. So when you are adding a custom logo in the EXP for the UEFI, before the UEFI even boots, you don't have the verification of it. They note later on, let's see. So you've got all the data that tells you how big the image is, how much bit depth there is, the type it is basically, and how to parse it out. They made a note about Dell in here somewhere. So a lot of times, most of these, in order to facilitate customization of the boot logo, don't have proper image validation built into the parsers and decoders, so they end up just running with whatever code, and that's where we get the problems with the buffer overflow, null pointer dereferencing, and so on. What's interesting is they did note that Dell, because of the way that they do their firmware, they do not reference any portion. They validate the image, but there's still certain things that Dell systems are still vulnerable to, in spite of their use of validation and, in essence, checksumming the firmware itself with itself. But that also requires basically being at the system itself in order to exploit the system with LogoFail. So, it would be later on in here that they mention it. So they develop a proof of concept to figure out, hey, we found these crashes with our fuzzer. Now let's try and see how many we can do arbitrary code execution on, or ACE, during the DXC phase, as noted here, and see, in essence, what we can do with it. Does it actually work, or does it just fail on the spot? So they sit there, they go through the image, and they explain parsing out the image, how you have the chunks of it, it goes through the different chunks, and then loads it all up. And later on, they explain, so what we can do is take an image, put it in there, and make it smaller than it should be, so that it overflows into arbitrary code that we can then put our payload as, and then it'll run the payload because it's trying to parse the image. But it kind of takes it there. So they did this with a real device, and they showed they verify secure boot, and they go from that to running the LogoFail exploit, and then reboot the machine in the same go. Now they create harmless code with it in order to show it, but this shows that we could lock up a system, execute ransomware, and so on. So this creates an attack vector for ransomware and other payloads before we even get into the UEFI, causing problems for a large number of businesses. And we're not even sure what server hardware they may be running, which means their servers could be vulnerable, let alone their user end stations. So if I skip through here, yeah, we're at 1080p, or should be. So open up the terminal. Basically, this part verifies a secure boot, and then we go in, and then they run the LogoFail payload, and then we wait for it to reboot. So this is their DXC phase boot, and they even have a menu thing for you to work with too. And then it boots in as normal because this was a harmless payload versus what is possible otherwise. And they also created a file on the system. So not only do you have access from DXC to the image and bypassing the boot loop, but you can manipulate files and the file system as well on top of it. So let's see. Large percentage of devices, UEFI firmware image out there contains a parser vulnerable, blah, blah, blah. So like, and can confirm that every OEM is impacted by the supply chain problem. So I find it interesting that we detected parsers vulnerable to LogoFail in hundreds of devices sold by Lenovo, which is really big in many different businesses because of ThinkPads, Supermicro, MSI, HP, again, another popular business choice, Acer, Dell, another popular business choice. So, and I think Dell is also a popular business choice among in the education sector. So this creates a problem for schools as well. Fujitsu, I remember them for cameras. Samsung, kind of halfway same deal, but they do tablets, which could cause a problem depending on if the business has that. And Intel, which I've seen a large number of Intel devices in schools as well. So I don't see any Asus on here, which I think is interesting because they do posit that pretty much every vendor is vulnerable to it, but they don't list them in here as such. So pretty much what they go on to explain is that this vulnerability relies on the user inputting data into the parser, and then the parser base kind of like going around the parser in order to get the code to run. So it creates a huge attack surface because of the number of devices that allow vendors or end users to customize boot logos, whether that be from the ESP or by reflashing the firmware, which they list as two big ones later on. Another discovered way to customize the logo is a firmware update procedure. You use the AMI tool, patch the firmware in PFAP format, and flash it, the capsules, or what all as such. So what they noted earlier on is that the logo isn't generally part of a signed block of the firmware, which was an exception in Dell systems. They would often sign the logo and verify the signature on the logo before they booted. So this halfway prevented the LogoFail from working on Dells, but they're still vulnerable to it because of their chip manufacturers. There's no expected way to customize the logo. It is still possible via physical attack vector, just with an SPI flasher program, so you're bypassing it on hardware by soldering to it. If the logo is not covered with any hardware-based verified boot technology, like Intel BootGuard and AMD hardware validated boot. So, as first shown in the previous screenshot, Dell distributes firmware where the logo is covered by Intel BootGuard, thus cannot be replaced by an attacker even using a physical attack. Dell doesn't provide any logo customization, so there's that one. However, despite these devices not being at immediate risk, they still contain image parsers with a high severity vulnerabilities that need to be fixed. So this is the deal, is that even though they may not be vulnerable based on their boot process and their hardware processes, they still have the problem of having the vulnerable parsers and those being out of date, so they need to update those and get those up to snuff so that they are not vulnerable, because even though these other layers are in place, if someone were to find a way to circumvent those layers, they could still take advantage of another layer. So you kind of walk your way around one problem and then come back to the exploit vector that you were looking for at originally. Even though you may have been stopped by two locked doors, there's probably still another open door elsewhere that you can take advantage of. So let's see. Implications. So big business implications. Heap-based buffer overflow, out of bounds read. So again, this graphic kind of shows the boot process that we're going through with it. Are you kidding me? Well, I guess I can't open it. So we are going to do the zoom in. No, it's too big. Okay, so here we've got the initialization of the firmware, basically the DXC dispatcher. So, and then LogoFail comes in right between that and the UEFI secure boot. So this bypasses secure boot because it loads up before secure boot can even initialize. And then you basically have everything else underneath it that is vulnerable. So this becomes way cooler than a rootkit. Well, you can create a rootkit using the exploit and then continue to have persistence on it because you are starting before secure boot even gets in. So just because you've got secure boot enabled doesn't mean you're completely safe. So, and then you've got the rest of the options. You go in to UEFI, ROM options, UEFI bootloader, then you get the OS bootloader, and then the OS kernel later on. So, and then keys are exchanged across the way, and in some cases it really doesn't matter at this point. So, you boot up your bootloader, you load up the kernel, and it's all still vulnerable or could be messed with because of the very second step, basically, of the logo being loaded in the DXC mode, or portion of the boot process. So it's a pretty cool exploit, pretty nifty, and it's kind of funny how many things are actually vulnerable to it. So make sure to look out for updates, and hopefully they do fix these soon. So if you are looking for a UEFI update, it's a good time to look for one. If you enjoyed the video, then like, comment, subscribe, feed the algorithm, boost the video up, share this video with your friends. If you found it informative or you just want to chat, I've got plenty of places in the description. Discord, Guilded, and what have you. Check those out, and I will see you guys in the next one.